Kia ora and welcome to One Young Mind podcast. It's a fact that our young people live in an increasingly addictive digital world, and whilst that world can bring a lot of positives, what exactly are the risks? I'm Matilda Green, content creator, presenter and mother of three.
And I'm Dr. Maneesh, Deva, paediatrician. This podcast discusses mental health issues, self-harm and suicide, so please listen with care. If you or someone you love is struggling, please reach out to a professional for help. Helpline numbers can be found in the show notes of this podcast.
We often talk about the human cost of online harm and youth mental distress. Today we want to talk about the economic cost of doing nothing, why inaction is not just socially irresponsible but economically irrational, because sometimes the most expensive thing we can do is nothing. With us today is Shamubeel Eaqub, Chief Economist from Simplicity. Thanks for being here, Shamubeel.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Shamubeel. While we've got you, we might start with an economics type question. These social media companies seem to have got very profitable, very powerful. How does their business model work?
Well, they work in two ways. One, they have created places where everybody hangs out, and they have taken in essentially the advertising that used to be in traditional media. So they have funneled in the money and they've funneled in the eyeballs.
Yeah, and so that attention economy or eyeball economy, I guess that's one of the things which can lead people to stay on the platforms for a long time.
I mean, it's very addictive, right? The whole point is you want to make it almost like a story, but it's like the fast food of stories, right? It feels like it has a beginning, middle, and an end, but it's very unsatisfying. So you must consume more and more of this stuff, and you get stuck. Same happens with TV and other things too, right? The whole purpose of media is to kind of grab your attention. But with technology and with social media, we've really perfected that. Like, people are really on these devices for a long time.
So would you say that their main profit comes from just the more people that are on there and for the longer that they're on it for?
Oh, absolutely. It's all about the network effect. So it's essentially, if this is where everybody is, this is where everybody else must be too. So it multiplies, right? So no point in being on traditional websites if people aren't there. If people aren't watching linear TV, no point in advertising on linear TV. If people are watching TikTok or YouTube or whatever, you want your ads and you want your time to be there. But also for us, right? If you want that interaction in an online community, you got to go where other people are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just on that, I've heard this phrase, you might be able to explain it a bit more, that perhaps for a young person, they're actually the product in this model. So it's a bit different from other businesses.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've always been commodified, right? So the whole point of, I guess, the financialization of an economy is we want to kind of make money out of you somewhere, one way or the other. The difference with social media is that because you're such a unique person, you've been sliced and diced so many times, everything is targeted towards you in a much more individualist way than ever before. So we are much more sold in a product and a commodity in a very specific way that wasn't possible before. And so very good at dishing up things to us, very good at selling things to us, very good at converting us, which was not always the case. So there is a precision and a science to this selling economy that I don't think we've seen before.
Well, we've seen a few journalists have gone onto online platforms and signed themselves up as a young person. And it doesn't always seem to be things they're actually wanting. It just wants them on the platform any which way. And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I think there are some really big concerns around the ethics of how these operations work. I think there is an underlying nature of addiction that's really problematic. Because, as you know, when you're younger, your brain is not sufficiently developed and you're much more prone to being affected and converted by these kinds of efforts. So, when I've done work, for example, in gambling in the past, what you know is that it's almost a physiological thing. Once you become addicted, it's very hard to become unaddicted. And I worry about the same thing with what's going on with essentially our online spaces. And it's not just social media, it's just the broader online space where everything is at your fingertips, which is so beyond what our human brain is capable of. We've always been starved of information, right? And as that has grown and grown over time, we have found it harder and harder to deal with it. And I worry particularly about our young people because you necessarily don't necessarily have the tools to be able to make sense of the deluge, to make sense of what's happening. It's not easy for adults either, right? And imagine what it's like for a younger person who hasn't necessarily learned those tools that might be necessary for them to deal with, I guess, all the stuff that's coming at them.
And we seem to see a lot of harms with young people, which have really accelerated in the last 10 years. What would be the economic impact of that?
Look, there's a few different ways of thinking about it. I did some work with NetSafe a few years ago looking at the cost of cyberbullying and just the amount of bullying that has gone from the playground to this constant 24/7 online space, multiplied and magnified. And that was really troubling just to see just how pervasive it has become and just how worried the kids are, but also their parents and grandparents. There's a wider kind of cost to that. But there's also just a wider cost that we're seeing in terms of essentially people kind of becoming disconnected from their local communities as well. So there's kind of this different ways of thinking about this cost. It's not just this. I think sometimes we get too caught up. I mean, funny, an economist talking about being too caught up in costs. But quite often it's hard to quantify what these things are doing. And the harms are quite often not fully known. So particularly in the online space, the thing that I worry about is we shouldn't always kind of go, it's all bad, because it's not. There's lots of good things. But there's also some harms, right? And those harms are things we need to focus on and go, how can we reduce them or manage them or stop them? Because you can't do everything all at the same time. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I feel like when it comes to the online space, it's happened so quickly, right?
Yep.
Every new technology comes at us really, really fast. But this technology has come really fast and it is still evolving really quickly.
Yeah, and you've spent years kind of analysing where New Zealand invests and where it doesn't. When it comes to youth well-being, do you think we're investing in the right places currently?
Look, when it comes to our young people, there's always been a little bit of a blind spot. So, we've always kind of invested in things like education and those very specific big-ticket items. But when it comes to that, essentially customizing things for new generations with new social and economic context, that's been slower to evolve. And I really worry that when it comes to particularly areas like mental health, in terms of dealing with some of these online issues here, and when I think about social media and some of the pressures on young people, that leads to a sense of hopelessness, anxiety, all those other things, and we're not getting good at dealing with them. And it's not just this generation, right? When you look at the data, what you can see is that anxiety has been increasing with every generation over the course of the last 60, 70 years. And we also know that anxiety tends to build through life. So if you're an anxious person when you're young, you won't have the tools and resilience to be able to deal with the anxieties of life as you get older. And so I really worry that that's going to be a really big challenge for this coming generation, not only because there is a general increase in levels of anxiety and mood disorders in New Zealand, but because our young people are just going to be more predisposed in future periods. A long-winded way of saying the cracks that we're starting to see in the way that we look after young people is we're still thinking about it as spending for young people 40 or 50 years ago rather than the pressures that we see today.
And that generation that's growing up, I guess we've had such a skyrocketing of anxiety, mental distress. It's almost become part of normal childhood now. What does that look like for someone entering into the workforce?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things going on, right? There is just a lot of pressures that are coming at our younger generations all at the same time. The world is a much more unstable, uncertain place when you think about what's going on with climate change and the fact that it feels like we've backslid so much that we're guaranteed terrible outcomes. So our young people are right to be concerned. And those concerns are being amplified by some of those other things that are happening in their lives, in the way that we communicate with each other, the way we connect with each other, the fact that, the sense of solidarity in our communities is falling, depth of friendships quite often are becoming less deep. All those things are kind of multiplying. And I can see why there are good reasons for people to be anxious. But to my mind, at least, the state of anxiety is because there's a sense of helplessness, that there is no way for us to deal with it. It's just going to happen regardless of what I do, which I don't think is true. I think we still have time to make choices. I still think there are ways for us to deal with things. And those are the tools that we need to give our young people. But it's not just young people. It's also our politicians and the people in charge who are mucking it up.
Just on that kind of how we've ended up here and maybe what we've mucked up. You mentioned gambling, and there's been alcohol, tobacco. There's other things which seem to be harmful that those kind of businesses operate, but they seem to pay like an excise tax or an offset. But the social media company seems to have dodged that. And how have they done that, and is that the right thing?
Well, for now, right? So if you think about the harms of tobacco, for example, was known for a very long time before we started to do something about it. And even then, that battle is not won. Particularly in New Zealand, we're backsliding on our tobacco rules, which is completely shameful. But I think that gives you an example of just how powerful these interests can be. There's a huge amount of money at stake, and they'll do everything that's possible to not have to pay those taxes or those costs. So I think when you think about social media, it's so young. It's not surprising that it's kind of skirted around the legal kind of issues. But the other reason why that has been the case is because it's not a physical product, and our rules and regulations are still very reliant on physical things in physical spaces. The online world is still one that's kind of, dancing around the regulatory boundaries. And I think that's one of the big challenges. But there is a parallel with things like climate change, right? So when you've got these big issues that affect everyone in the world, how do you come together to have policies that work for everyone? And if you can't, what can you do in your own country to try and deal with it? And we're getting some examples of that, right? You look at places like Australia, where they're going to try and do the social media ban for young people. Will it work? I don't know. Is it worth trying? Absolutely.
Do you think part of the problem is that the impacts of online harm are so diffused, like across health, across education, justice, productivity? So there's not one system that's wearing the full cost, and they're all in the silos dealing with them on their own?
What's funny is that's actually true for almost every problem.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's mental health, whether it's, whatever. Because we're humans and we are part of society, and those costs will always be borne in different parts of our lives and our experiences. And I think that's a fundamental problem that we have with dealing with problems, full stop. So quite often we'll go, here is a health problem, let's have a health fix. But then because you haven't done anything on education and you haven't done anything on whatever else, it doesn't quite work, because you're trying to have this one particular way of dealing with the problem. So you deal with one aspect of it. So, if you think about, for example, kidney disease, you'd think, oh, that's a health issue. Yes, but it also stops people from working. So it's a workplace issue. It makes it hard for people to turn up to work regularly, so it becomes a productivity issue. So it is all of those things. But you're right. I think with the online space, it is even more so. It is even more diffuse. And also because it's so new, it's much harder for, I guess, those older generations to even grapple with what it means. It's just a completely different way of seeing the world. Certainly, for me, Facebook came along when I was a grown adult. So for me, Facebook is something that's over there. It's not something that is an integral part of my life. Whereas, I've got colleagues, for them, they grew up with Facebook as as an extension of their social space, which is a very different way of seeing the world, right? And I can't even conceptualize how they think of the world that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, how we use Instagram is also very different to how someone who's, 14 or 15 would.
Yeah, trust me, I know how old I feel.
Yeah, when Matty says we use Instagram, I always feel old because I don't have an Instagram account yet.
Neither. I'm terrible at this kind of thing.
But what I've noticed is it is really hard, because even when we talk about social media, a young person's version of social media might be entirely scrolling through short-form video, where I'm used to hearing about birthdays on my Facebook web app. So
we're sounding so old right now.
Yeah, the boomers over here.
Well, so like, for example, at my work, sometimes I'll do videos that'll be put on TikTok. And it's like, I don't even know what it looks like, because it's not my thing. But it's a very short thing. And then I always struggle, because I go, but there's so much more I want to say. And they're like, no, you can't say anymore. That's it. That's all the time you've got.
Yeah, we need 5 seconds and then enough.
But the problem is, as humans, we need context. We need a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we need enough substance through the process for us to really get to grips with a story, right? A narrative. But what we get in social media quite often is this hyper compressed mimicry of a story. But it doesn't have the depth, it doesn't have the connection, it doesn't have the satisfaction. So it is like that fast food, the empty version of a story. And we are constantly consuming this stuff, and it's relentless, because you can't be satisfied. it's not possible to be satisfied with this.
I guess that's one of my concerns developmentally for a young person. If they get used to something, doesn't grab their attention in a few seconds, they dismiss it or block it, or they say something rude to someone. And then how does that work in the real world when they have to get a job?
And they have to do something boring.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we've all read the parental books about boredom being really important for children. But I guess the thing is, we also need to give the kids credit that they're not spending their entire lives on social media. They also have real lives outside of it. They're going to school, they're engaging in other spaces, and quite often they're practicing those skills. But are they practicing it enough is probably the question. I'd argue not, because certainly there's a lot of structure and things like that at school which you don't have when you get home. And if home life is not sufficiently structured, you might not be getting enough of the time to practice those things. But yeah, so I don't want to be too negative about our young people, because I meet so many young people that are coming through that are super smart, super engaged, super capable, certainly a hell of a lot smarter than I was at that age. So I have a lot of hope from that perspective. But I think there is a chunk of our young people who are really going to struggle because they don't necessarily have the support networks or the tools to be able to take themselves away from these addictive spaces, but also then lose some of those skills that you need to be successful in life. Being able to be bored, be uncomfortable, and still stick with it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, you're a doctor, so you know what it's like. You're going to have many uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, well, certainly going through med school is probably one of those things that you think, oh, who would sign up for this? But yeah, exactly. And I think there's been a lot written about the kind of how do you make kids anti-fragile in an environment where online is so just on-demand instant.
It is, but at the same time, you know that they're not going to find all the answers there. So, do you then have the tools to be able to go and do your own inquiry, to find your own connections? But the thing that I think is missing in all of this is online spaces can be really good, but are there sufficient parallel for the solidarity you'd get if the three of us got together and worked on something together? It could be, but it may not be.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, the potential is there, but at the moment, it doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah.
Partly, I think it's because, again, there's a range of people in the way that they experience and interact on social media. There are some people, old farts like me, who will speak as respectfully and as normally as I would online versus offline. But not everybody is like that. And there are lots of people who are much more aggressive, much more angry, much more dismissive online. But in real life, they're perfectly normal. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing a real person? Are we seeing a version of them which is actually their true self?
Yeah. I guess my concern is that I wonder the incentives these social media companies would have to do maybe the right thing or...
Well, the incentives are always to go for the 20% at the edges of the distribution. You never want the boring 80% in the middle. They're not interesting. They're not exciting. Like social media, all the views that you get here is very much that kind of the edges of the bell curve. These are the people who are on the fringes. We never get to see the majority, the silent majority in the middle. So you're absolutely right. So I think if you're in media, in any media, in fact, it's not just social media, right? Social media is just a hyperscale version of it. In any media, the idea is to take the fringes, the edge ideas, and push them really hard, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? So you want to make it as exciting as possible. But life and most of the good ideas are not that exciting. They're quite often boring.
Yeah, but I think outrage is addictive as well. And so when people are on social media and online, they read the outrageous articles and they engage with the outrageous content because it does something to your body. I don't know what, Maneesh, you probably know more than me, but that there's something hormonal that your body gets addicted to. And then you hear so much
I'm sure we
of that.
all feel it in our own lives. You almost have to rationally go, why am I so interested in this almost this titular thing, right? What is it about this one particular angle that's clearly very base?
Yeah.
And you're interested because actually the human mind is like that. So we are very wired for addiction, right? We are very wired to look for patterns. So all these things come together. I mean, I'm being a pseudopsychologist here, but you know what I mean? We are really wired for it. I mean, you can see it in your own kind of personal experiences that we like a little bit of outrage. We like that excitement. But liking the excitement doesn't make it the truth.
Yeah. And I think just thinking if this keeps playing out, what does that look like for our social cohesion, or what does that idea even mean for us going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think for me, that's the thing that worries me the most is around the world, we're seeing this general decline in social cohesion anyway. And it has been happening for a number of decades. And I think it has accelerated in recent years, in part because of, I guess, almost this fake connection that we have online and the real loneliness in real life that's increased. And, I'd describe it as an epidemic. This is not, I don't think it's being extreme to say that. I think it's become so widespread, particularly amongst young people who feel lonely, who feel disconnected, who feel like they don't have a connection with somebody else. It's really problematic. I did some work earlier this year looking at social cohesion in New Zealand, and probably the most troubling thing in that was just the extent of loneliness amongst young people. And I was really surprised by that, right? Because I don't know about you, but when I was young, I had a lot of friends and went to lots of parties, had lots of fun. Like, that's what being young was about. It's like, as you get older, you kind of drift off because, you've got responsibilities in life, right? But to see that in the statistics and, feeling people, it's not that they want to be lonely. Right? There is a real loss here. That's a real problem. And within that, there is this element of as you become lonely and you become disconnected from each other, it becomes much harder for us to empathize with each other, right? We can have different viewpoints, but doesn't mean we have to be enemies, right? And we lose that. We kind of lose that ability to kind of empathize with each other. And that's really what social cohesion is. It's just being able to get on with each other, right? And the way I describe it is, can you have an argument and still have a beer together afterwards? Because to me, that's a really good test, right? It means that we could have a discussion about an issue for its merits, but it doesn't mean our personal connection has to be sacrificed.
Yeah.
And that discomfort is okay, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is something that we've lost. And some people say that we can't pinpoint that to social media or being online, because it's really tricky to get that data of young people that aren't online, because most are. So what do you think we risk financially by waiting for perfect data or perfect consensus before doing something?
Well, there's no such thing as perfect in anything. And, I think that's where people who don't want to do something hide. So it's an excuse for not acting. And so when it comes to social media, you're right that we don't have perfect data, but we can see that when you have things like the cell phone bans and things like that, immediately we're seeing increases in participation and mental health. These are not accidents. There's some real reasons why that is the case. But when I also look at, for example, in Australia, they looked at the impact of social media kind of engagement on social cohesion, and what they found was those who are spending a lot more time on social media were less likely to be, to have friends, to have strong connections, so more lonely, less connected, more extreme in their viewpoints. So these are not, yes, the evidence is developing, but I think we need to see it for what it is. It's a highly addictive ways of interacting with each other in a way that's unfulfilling.
I'm so glad you mentioned the phone-free schools, and we just had the report last week.
Yes.
And there were some really striking findings, and just was that surprising to you, or was that what you thought, this seems right?
Well, I was hoping that it would show us these results, mainly because there was the hypothesis that there is harm from people being connected into their devices while you need the space to do these other things.
Yeah.
And the evidence shows that once you have removed those distractions, actually, we do get better outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think to me, it's because I'm not an expert in that area. So to me, it was more of a hypothesis to be tested. And I'm really glad to see that, one, we have tested it, not waiting for the perfect information, but giving it a go. And now that we've got enough information to go, it's actually doing a good job, we should think about where else should it apply.
What's the next step?
Have you had some thoughts about that? Because I was thinking, this seems like a pretty cost-attractive move. You just say, we've not got any phones away during education time. It doesn't need a whole lot of cost, apart from maybe some papers and reports being written. But schools seem to be able to do it without spending a lot.
Exactly. And not all actions need to be expensive. I think there is this kind of myth that every intervention is going to cost billions of dollars. Not always the case. Sometimes it's just saying we're just going to take a pause on a certain thing, or we're going to take a break for something. And sometimes stopping is as good a action as anything. The way that I think about it is, if it works in schools, how could it affect your home life, and how could it affect your work life? Because the reality is that too many of us are spending too much time on our devices at home. And what if we put on the do not disturb when we got home?
Yeah.
What if your phone was in the drawer when you got home rather than on you the whole time? What if at work time we had 4 hours of the day when you didn't check email or take phone calls and just focused on work? So there are lots of different ways, this could be expanded. And I think, so this is how I kind of do my work. Like, quite often I'll turn off all my emails and my phone when I'm writing a report, because if I don't, I'll never get there.
Right, yeah. That's
Because
a good
otherwise
insight.
you're constantly interrupted.
Yeah, I'm going to tell my managers about that one.
Go on.
Well, I guess anything that encourages more presence, I think, is a positive thing, whether it's at work or at home or at school. If you can just focus
Contextual.
on what you're doing in the moment, it's usually positive.
Absolutely. In the context, right? So if your job is to answer the phone, then don't turn it off.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one of the findings I just want to mention on that report, which is about 100 or so pages, quite well written, but a long report, finding number 14, that this intervention actually disproportionately helped those of lower socioeconomic status. Was that a surprise to you?
Again, not really. And let me tell you why. With the same stimulus, we know that more often than not, those in the bottom of the distribution curve are worse affected. So we quite often know there is a magnification effect, because quite often the kids that are not performing well quite often will have multiple issues they're bringing to the situation. So when you take away some of those negative things, the benefit is also disproportionate. It's almost nonlinear. So this is why when we think about designing interventions, we go, it doesn't necessarily need to be for everybody, but those who are most harmed, what can you do? Because that's where you're going to get the best payoff. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I certainly see it in hospital where, say, both parents are working multiple jobs. It's going to be harder to have those buffering effects of, the mum who's always picking you up and talking to you. It's really hard. So we've got a huge equity issue that we're kind of letting unfold on our young people as well in those numbers.
Absolutely. And so in economics, we kind of do these two words that we use a lot, efficiency and equity. So efficiency is how can you make sure something that works really well, and equity is how do we make sure that it's evenly felt across society. Quite often we focus too much on efficiency and not enough on equity. We go, this thing must be designed just right, so then it's perfect. Rather than going, actually, this thing is doing a lot of harm, and this harm is disproportionate for a group of people. And if we made this intervention, then the net effect would be really good, right? Both efficient and equitable, but neither is perfect. And trying to find that balance is really where policy decisions are always struggling to do it right. But you're absolutely right that when we're thinking about policy and interventions, it's really, really important we think about the equity lens, because quite often the harms are really quite disproportionate in some groups.
I like that idea of trade-offs. And you mentioned Australia. I don't know how closely you've been watching it. We've been watching it pretty closely. Any speculation on what they're doing right and what they would do, what we could do in New Zealand maybe a bit different, or we should take stock of?
Look, I mean, in my mind, we should be watching them very closely. Like we have done with our intervention with the schools in New Zealand, they're trying it over in Australia, and we can learn from them. And I think that should be our ambition. Rather than trying to predict what the outcome will be, I think the trick is to go, somebody's giving it a go. Yeah. See if it's working. And if it's working, let's do it here too.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of copy and paste.
Absolutely. And, well, copy, paste and tweak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an element of adaptation that's important. The way that I think about public policy is that there is no problem that hasn't been thought of by somebody else. So you don't need to invent the answer yourself on your own, right? Because there's this, in New Zealand in particular, we do have a slightly provincial kind of mindset that nothing that has been invented anywhere else could possibly work. We must take the number 8 wire and invent our own solution. That's not quite true. There are lots of things that we can adapt and, in fact, probably even adopt outright, and it would work really well. In this space, we know that New Zealand has a benefit of being quite nimble. Because we're small, we can move quite quickly. And when we see good examples elsewhere, I think that should be our invitation.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's come up a few times on this show, the fast follower advantage or second mover advantage we might have there.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, the thing is, you don't have to be the leader in everything, but it's kind of nice to be leading, right? But the problem with leading is if you're risk averse, it's really problematic because you will make mistakes. So in New Zealand, we do not suffer experiments, right? You know, the PM must resign because this one policy didn't quite work. Well, if it's a bleeding edge policy, then it might not work. What have you learned? And are you allowed to fail and learn from it? The answer is not really. So we do have a problem in our society where we are unwilling to countenance failure. And then we tell our children, oh, you should be resilient. Well,
Maybe we should practice what we preach.
I was going to say, there's probably a little bit of that international psyche there we could improve as well. But to my mind, I think that's a problem. And that's why the fast following is so attractive to New Zealand, because culturally it makes it much safer for us to be able to adopt something that somebody else has already tried.
And if we do act now, what sort of gains do you think we could see? Not just financially, but socially, economically?
Look, I mean, fundamentally, the kinds of interventions we're talking about is how do we protect our young people from the harms of online spaces while still letting them have the benefits of online spaces, because it's about that balance, right? In my mind, the benefit is the most precious resource that New Zealand has now is our young people. Right? We're running out of young people. So, we haven't been frisky for a very long time as a country. Our birth rate has been falling for decades, and it's a really big problem. So essentially our entire economic system, our fiscal system, is, our fiscal promises and our taxes are all set up on the idea that we're going to have at least 5 working age people per retiree. Well, we don't. We now have 4. And in 50 years' time, we're going to have 2. So we're going to have some big decisions coming at us. So we're going to really need our young people to be a big part of being the leaders of our future, being the workers of our futures, the taxpayers, all of these. And they have to deal with climate change. Right?
It's a big ask.
We want these young people to be as resilient, as capable as possible. And so the interventions today are really about that part, that resilience that you talked about is, yes, there are all these challenges that are coming at you, but we trust you because you've probably got access to more knowledge than any other generation before you. We're probably gonna have the best science that's available of any generation. Yes, there are big challenges, but how do we also give you these other tools to be able to do that well? But I don't think we're setting them up right now. We started on the conversation around anxiety and mood disorders and loneliness and all those kinds of things. These are really, really big problems amongst our young people. We are not setting them up for success in a way that we should.
And if we've got parents listening thinking, I want the best career for my young person, which is probably every parent's dream, I want them to be successful. Any things from you as a parent where you think, well, this is a good thing, this is what resilience is like as a young person, and this will lead them into their future workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I've got kids, and you think about this all the time, and it's really about how do you raise a good human, right? It really is that.
What sort of values do you want to give them?
Exactly. I think this focus on you're going to become X, Y, Z, and there's going to be this linear pathway to success is not true for anybody. I mean, I know it's a little bit different for doctors in that there's a huge commitment, and there's a track to become a doctor. Whereas, if I think about my kind of career and just how many kind of, zigzags it took over time, my children, the jobs they will do might not even exist today. So it's not about when you're thinking about how do I set them up for success, it's not this, can I give them course X or university Y? It's more about those values and their ability to be able to deal with things. The other thing that I notice amongst, young people that I've employed is the ones that are able to, work at McDonald's, have friends, go to parties, and still get a B+, they're the ones who are the most resilient. Not the A+ students who stayed at home and studied and didn't have friends because they've missed out on those other bits of life that are also important. So when you're thinking about, raising good humans, and of course it's going to be very, very individual, I think at its core is that idea of solidarity and friendship and networks. Is, are you a person who's able to feel for other people, including people who are your friends? That's the bit that sets you up for success because people around you are the one who are going to ensure your success.
I love that. And then what about policymakers? If you had just a word of advice for any policymakers, if they're listening, if they're going to bring in regulation around social media, what would your advice be?
Well, the advice is really around thinking about equity. Are we seriously considering the impact on young people including generations yet to be born, right? Because I think quite often when we make policy, it's made for middle-aged men. And that's not really what this is about. Policy needs to be suitable for everybody, and particularly for when it comes to social media and the online spaces, for younger people in particular. And therein lies, I think, the big opportunity. If we want to kind of create good policies that have enduring good outcomes, it's about how those policies will set up our future generations for success. We don't ask that question very often. And I really struggle with this because children are, by and large, silent in the policymaking process or absent. And yet, most of the things that we do, they will bear the consequences of that. Right? We're all going to be dead before most of the things that we screw up really becomes a big problem. Think about climate change. Think about any of those big issues. Our inaction today is not going to affect us personally because we're going to be dead. But our children and grandchildren, they're going to have to deal with the consequences of our inaction. So my kind of advice to public policy people has always been, how can we make sure everybody's present in the room when we're making that policy decision? When we talk about equity, it's not just about everybody who's here today, but it's all those people who are still to come. And when you take that viewpoint, you take a much stronger view on the value of action.
Yeah, because you had a great line that young people are really our asset going forward. They're the ones who are going to fund services. They're the one who's going to support us in our older years.
Or not.
Or not. We don't know what that might look like. But, I think that is a fantastic message. And we've touched on this phone-free schools, and you said, so what do you think? What do we do with those learnings? Do we scale it out more? Do we think, what would you say?
Well, I mean, in my mind at least, the natural next step is if it is really such a positive thing, should we not be thinking about it for the outside of school hours? And of course, there is all the kind of overlaps with privacy and agency and self-determination and all those issues. Of course, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there are some really big implications that if we know that it's improving our kids' performance and their mental health because they're not using their phones at school, why is it okay for them to be using it outside of school? And is it the phone, or is it the fact that they're not on social media and all those other bits and pieces? But also, like I said before, I think there are also kind of things that we should ask ourselves, the parents and the grandparents. I think we're just as complicit in this.
Absolutely. I think there is an ethical dilemma in my head. If we know this stuff and we know there's some harms linked and we don't do anything, that seems even worse than writing the report.
Well, I think, individually, like we talked about before, it is that element of just maybe rationing your time with your device. I know it's really hard. It's very addictive. Devices are just as addictive as the apps on the devices. So there's an element of, can we kind of wean ourselves a little bit? I think that's the individual thing. But there's also the systemic policy thing that you mentioned before, are there ways we should be thinking about these things? And we can't regulate for everything. So, there is a kind of a sequence of things that you do. You can educate, you can kind of help people do things, you can tax, you can regulate. But in this space, I think it's quite difficult, right? You can't say you can't have a phone, right? Very difficult to say that. But we can say that, look, it causes harm, and you might want to think about limiting it. It's like, the ugly pictures on the cigarette packets. You maybe need something like that. Maybe we do need to have some ways to ration ourselves. But we also need to give people tools, right?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of parents listening as well will relate to that, because we know the harms, but it's still really difficult. And I think just sharing the tools more widely, or ways that we can manage it for ourselves and model the kind of behaviour we want to see for our young people as well.
That's right. And I think it takes time for these things to get through. So, when it's a new bit of knowledge, I think it takes a little bit of time to seep through to the general consciousness, and that's absolutely fine. And that's why it's so important for us to have these conversations and to kind of keep lifting up the message in as many different places as possible. The way that I see it in terms of how conversation shifts in a country is it takes somewhere between 5 and 10 years to go from seeing a problem to demanding action. But when that happens, it can happen very quickly. So I think there's reason for us to be hopeful that we can do better and that we're on that journey. So it's really important we start with, one, identifying the problem and really calling it what it is, that it is addiction, that it is harmful, that it is worse for young people. We need to sort of throw them out as facts, right? These are things that we have evidence to back up. So it's not just a view, it's actually what's going on. And once we kind of get that in and people have accepted that, then you can say, and did you know there are things we can do? And that's all people need to know. They don't need to know the specifics. They just need to know that there are solutions, and if we pursue them, we will generally get better outcomes. That's generally how, I guess, societal shift takes place.
It seems like there is a bit of a shift because for years these companies have fought restriction, regulation, age gating, but it seems now even they're conceding we know there are harms, but we're trying to be on the right side of that. Whether or not they genuinely acting on that, we've had a very interesting podcast with a Facebook whistleblower who suggests completely otherwise. But it seems like there is a bit of a shift and the public seems to be on board.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you think about the incentives, I mean, for the companies themselves, for them, there is no incentive to restrict their markets, right? So nobody wants to do that. So those incentives don't align. So you need to see it for what it is. They're not evil people and they're not evil things. They just are. The incentives are such that they will inevitably try and do this kind of thing. And so you have to ask yourself, given that those are the incentives, what shall I do instead? I mean, nobody looks at a tobacco company and goes, oh, what a nice bunch of people, right?
Well, in the 50s, I think doctors were quite on board with smoking during pregnancy and unusual
and this
remedies
is how it changes,
for things.
right?
Yeah, it takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're all vulnerable to
But
this.
even now, just because somebody works in a tobacco company doesn't mean they're an evil person.
No.
And you have to be able to disentangle that individual from the organization and the incentives that kind of create those conditions, right? So inevitably, those who profit from this will be opposed and they will try and slow it down. That's their job, right? And so we have to see ourselves outside of that and go, given those conditions, what should we do?
Yeah, because this is great to have an economist here. Because from a business model, you mentioned some of the things your device might do, like do not disturb, don't annoy me, which seems like that's a really good business model. I pay my $2,000, but they don't want any more money out of me. But all these free things are not really free at all because they want you all the time. And I think, well, maybe just the business model was wrong because they just need those eyeballs all the time. Whatever it takes, you can't look away from your device. But I find with the devices, they seem to be, oh yeah, age restriction is a good idea. It's important we know what age things and apps you can see. What are your thoughts on that?
It is and it isn't. I think in a way they're a little bit earlier in the life cycle.
Right.
And,
So do you think we're at the kind of smoke for low birth weight during pregnancy? Like we're at that stage of
Early
tobacco?
innings.
It's also because devices are physical things. They're easy to regulate, right? So I can say, if you want to sell this thing, you need to have this information. You need to collect this information. Our existing legal structures are able to deal with it. As soon as you get out of that into the online space, it's a lot harder. So I don't want to give our device makers a free pass because those apps don't exist in a vacuum.
No.
Right? So they are designed to work really well on your device. They're designed to keep you glued onto this device, right? That's your medium of addiction. So I don't want to give them a free pass because I don't think they're doing less harm because they're willing to countenance an age restriction. The fact is the harm is being done on their device. So, but you're right. I think the conversation has shifted. I think there's a much greater maturity than has been the case. And partly because of the very extreme outcomes, isolated but small numbers, the very extreme outcomes that we've seen.
And technology is moving so fast. We've got probably another huge headache coming at us with AI and just a smattering of different models. You're either free, things that can chat to you without you kind of wanting them to, and then some that you really have to pay for it to get access. How do you see that playing out, and what do we need to think about with AI and young people and how this is probably the next thing in our lives?
Yeah, I think, again, it's about understanding how the thing works. You don't have to know the perfect way that everything works, but you need to have the broad underlying thesis of how this thing is put together. So the fact that, artificial intelligence in LLMs, they're kind of like an averaging machine. They're going, if this word happens here, then these words will follow. It's not as smart as people think. It literally is an association generator, right?
Yeah.
And that's why so much of what it writes is slop. So AI is very useful in certain instances and not so useful in other things. And I think people want to kind of vilify things for good or bad. Like I guess, a little bit what we've been trying to do, right? But the way I think about it is everything is a tool, and how it's used is what determines whether it's good or bad. And so same with phones, right? Phones are really useful for getting in touch with people. But if you're sitting on it all day, then it's probably not that good. Same with social media. I mean, in the beginning of Facebook, it was nice to reconnect with your old friends, wasn't it?
It was great. It was
Wasn't it
very
lovely?
lighthearted. Well, like even TikTok, it was just dances. It was just lighthearted dances.
And then it can spiral out because, technology used in a particular way can be good, or if it's used in a particular way, it can be bad. But it's very fast and it scales up really quickly. I think it's a magnifier. So, my kind of usual crack at AI questions during conferences is, the whole purpose of AI is it makes a stupid person stupider and a smart person smarter.
Okay, I'll try and think which one of those.
Which way are we going to go?
And it's because when you see something, the question is, do you still have the tools to be able to look at it and still make sense of it? The sense making is what matters, right? So, we learn comprehension at school. It's the same. It's like AI comprehension. AI has said this, but how do I then interpret it within the context of the information that I have, the values that I have, and all those other bits and pieces? The way I use it in my work, for example, is I'll use your AI quite often to go, I'm doing this conference and I'm going to give a presentation. What should I talk about? And it'll tell me the things that it knows. And then I'll think about what is not on that list that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
What's different about me? So in my mind is a distribution curve, again, that normal distribution, and your value is on the edges.
Yeah.
So machine learning, all technological progress, whether it's libraries or the internet or whatever, it's all been about democratizing the middle. And all the exciting stuff lives on the edges.
Yeah.
That's still going to be missed. And that's quite often where the answers to tricky questions lie. That's quite often where these things happen. Just wanted to touch on the AI thing with young people because I think the chat thing is a little bit concerning for me because people are seeing it in almost as a companion perspective, as a person who's a friend, but it's not clear to me that's necessarily the right thing to do. And I worry that, if we see it as a substitute for a real living human who's able to provide you contextual, values-laden answers, that you're going to miss a lot, right? And so that's probably an area that I worry a lot about young people because they don't always have had experience of what a real individual conversation might look like.
Yeah, well, that's like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, when you can disagree with someone and then you can still see them as a whole person. But with these chatbots, I mean, they just agree with everything you say. It's very superficial,
and it's also very sycophantic, right? But also it's kind of this idea that there's one truth. Like the fact that the pursuit of knowledge is always about how do we learn more about things. There are very few absolute facts, absolute knowns. Sure, a few proofs in physics and maths, but outside of that, a lot of it is just things that we're learning as we're going, right? So absolute truths are very rare in humanity. So when you've kind of been presented with information in a way that's overconfident, it's quite problematic.
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge. I think about this a lot because even when you do a Google search, you get a list of links and you kind of apply your sniff test or this one seems like the right one. But these things are so confidently wrong to young people and say this is the answer.
And to older people.
Yeah, and older people, exactly. And if you're a young person figuring out your values and it says, well, this is the thing to do.
But the thing is, it will get better. The technology will get better. It'll get more accurate. It'll become more sophisticated. So, there was in the consulting space in Australia, there was a big report that was done by Deloitte, and they used AI for some of it, and it turned out a lot of the references were just made up. And so you still have to check, right? You still have to fact check. You still have to kind of. It's not, you can't go, AI did my homework.
You can't blindly trust
Yeah.
it. No, no.
It's like, it can't be the modern dog that ate your homework. You kind of actually still have to do the work, and you have to stand behind your own work. So, again, it's that thing about if you see it as a tool to be used, and it is fallible, then it's okay, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're now seeing that AI is learning about self-preservation. And so it's learning that you turning me off is bad. So it starts not making its own sentient decisions, but it understands the need for self-preservation.
And the thing is, the model of AI that we're using now, this is well beyond my expertise, but I saw this great presentation on AI when I was at a conference, and this is like the dumbest AI we'll ever have. So the next iterations are going to get smarter and smarter and smarter. So it's coming one way or the other. And, there's going to be a huge amount of work around ethics and those guardrails and those kinds of things. But also there's an element, the human element of it is how do you think about these issues? How do we tool people up to be able to make these things? And is the antidote in the technology or is the antidote out in the real world? And my sense is that the antidote is actually out in the real world. I find that the most gratifying things in life are those personal interactions that give you that moment of joy, right? There's a spark. You can't replicate that with, 1,000 likes on Twitter. It's just not the same thing. So I know nobody uses Twitter anymore. But, the sense of connection, that solidarity, I know I use that word a lot, but to me, those are actually really important things.
They're fundamental.
As a human.
They're a fundamental human need.
But we are replacing them with this, online fast food version of it. And that's quite problematic. And quite problematic because, when you don't know the real thing, it's very hard for you to have that resilience that we talked about. So I know we're going around in circles, but because I think it does go around in circles, and it all circles back to, I think, human connections and society and interactions between people, because that's the thing that you can't take away. No amount of technology is going to take away your friendships.
Yeah.
No, I think it is great to labour the point because we've tried this experiment, it seems. It's not working, and we're at this kind of point where it feels like it's a now what moment. What are we going to do now?
Yeah, I think it was, when a lot of social media came out, the idea was it would magnify your networks.
Why does a child need business networks? I don't know.
but friends networks as well.
Friends networks, real friends maybe.
Well, sure, but I guess, again, we're probably showing our age. Some people will have online friends that they're very close to, and they will have that proximity. But the question is, how do we know that it's
not a bot,
reliable?
Not a 40, 50-year-old male,
Well,
whatever,
that's the thing.
all those things, right?
Yeah.
But so I think, we kind of keep on asking about, so what can we do? I think partly it's around how do we teach our children? And I know this is not the focus of our conversation today, but it's partly about our curriculum at school. It's not just about teaching them how to write, read, write, do maths, that kind of stuff. It's also about teaching them and giving them the opportunities to practice those exercises in solidarity, right? Just how do you kind of be a part of a group? How do you kind of be part of society? Those are big questions. And arguably, we haven't done a very good job of that because you didn't need to. Yeah. But I think we do need to do that very purposefully in our education system now.
I would agree with that, 100%.
I wrote down 2 bits of advice. One to my kids, I'm going to say, Shamubeel recommended you work at McDonald's. And I'm not sure how to broach the lack of friskiness with my wife, but I'll let you know.
The other thing was around, I guess, our leaders. When it comes to leadership, it's really important that our leaders realize how important this stuff is, right? And leaders have a very strong role to play in terms of raising awareness of these issues, but also to kind of remove the stigma. Quite often there's a stigma, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, or whatever. I think leaders can play a really big role in that. So leadership in every field, every part of society, whether it's in a business or whether it's in an organization or whatever, that ability to kind of talk about these issues in a way that I think raises awareness is really helpful. And I think there is an element of just giving people the space to be able to experiment and try things. When somebody wants to be offline and unavailable from the device, it shouldn't be seen as the thing of shame, but thing as something that's actually courageous and to be encouraged.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, Shamubeel, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on One Young Mind.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to One Young Mind. We're on a mission to understand what our tamariki are experiencing online, to listen, connect, and make sense of this challenging topic, bringing the conversation to the forefront. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe so you never miss an episode, and share it with someone who cares about the well-being of young people.
We'd also like to thank everyone who makes this podcast possible. We simply couldn't do it without you. Executive producers Flicker Williams and Julie Clothier, editor Luke Johnson, Omzi for our branding and design, and the recording team at PodLab, and our commercial partners 2 Degrees and iHeartRadio and the team at Before 16. Thanks for listening. Ka kite anō.